The violin case hit the floor of the school hallway with a loud crack, and every student around Elena Marsh turned to look. She dropped to her knees fast, hands shaking, and opened the case to check the instrument inside. It was fine. It was always the one thing that had to be fine. "Careful," said a girl standing over her, arms crossed, designer bag hanging from her shoulder. "That old thing looks like it belongs in a museum, not a school hallway." A few students laughed. Elena did not look up. She closed the case gently, latched it, and stood. The girl who had spoken was Camille Ashworth, and everyone at Ashworth Academy knew her name before they knew their own locker number. Her father owned half the tech companies whose logos were printed on the laptops every student carried. Camille did not need to raise her voice to be heard. People simply listened, because not listening had a cost. Elena said nothing. She slung the case over her shoulder and walked to class, her cheeks burning, her chest tight. She had been at Ashworth Academy for 3 weeks. In that time, she had learned the names of exactly 4 people who spoke to her without a sneer attached. Everyone else treated her like a mistake the school had not yet corrected. She was here on a full music scholarship, the first one the school had given out in 9 years. She had earned it after a state competition where she played a piece she had written herself, alone in a practice room with peeling paint, using a violin that had belonged to her mother. The judges had gone quiet after she finished. One of them had cried. That moment had felt like the beginning of something good. Now, walking through marble hallways lined with oil paintings of the school's donors, she wondered if she had made a mistake. In her first class, Advanced Music Theory, the teacher, Mr. Douglas, called the room to order and began writing chord progressions on the board. Elena took her seat in the back corner, the same seat she chose every day, the one nobody fought her for. Camille sat near the front, surrounded by 3 girls who laughed at everything she said half a second before she finished saying it. "Today," Mr. Douglas said, setting down his marker, "I want someone to demonstrate expressive phrasing, not perfect technique. I want feeling." The room went still in the way rooms go still when nobody wants to be picked. "Camille," Mr. Douglas said, "would you like to start us off?" "Piano is right there." Camille smiled, the kind of smile that had been practiced in front of mirrors since childhood, and shook her head slowly. "Actually," she said, glancing back over her shoulder, her eyes landing on Elena like a spotlight finding its mark, "I think the new girl should go. She's the scholarship student, right? I'm sure she's used to performing for people." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Elena felt her stomach drop the way it did on the first big hill of a roller coaster, except there was no thrill in it, only the sick anticipation of a fall she could not stop. "Elena," Mr. Douglas said, unaware of the weight behind Camille's suggestion, or perhaps aware and choosing to ignore it, "would you like to play something for us?" Every eye in the room turned toward the back corner. Elena's hands had gone cold. She thought about saying no. She thought about the words forming in her mouth, some excuse about not being prepared, about needing more time. But underneath the fear was something else, something stubborn that had kept her alive through harder days than this one. She stood, walked to the front of the room, and opened her violin case. Camille leaned toward the girl beside her and whispered something. The girl giggled behind her hand. Elena heard none of the words, but she did not need to. She had heard enough versions of that whisper in 3 weeks to know exactly what it meant. She lifted the violin to her shoulder, her mother's violin. The wood was worn smooth at the chin rest from decades of use, first by her grandmother, then by her mother, and now by her. It was not a fine instrument by the standards of a school like this. It had a small crack near the scroll that had been repaired twice. But it had a voice, and Elena knew that voice better than she knew her own reflection. She raised the bow. For a moment, nothing happened. The classroom waited, half of it already smirking, already certain of how this would go. Camille sat with her arms crossed, a small, satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth, the look of someone who has already won before the game begins. Then Elena began to play. The first note was quiet, almost hesitant, like a question asked in a whisper. The second note answered it, and then the melody unfolded. Not from a page, not from memory of some composer long dead, but from somewhere inside Elena that she rarely let anyone see. It was a piece she had written herself, in the months after her mother died, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed that had since been folded up and taken away, in an apartment that echoed too much now that there was only one person left to fill it. The melody moved slowly, aching, each note stretching like it did not want to let go of the one before it. It was not technically perfect. There was a slight waver in one of the higher notes, a breath caught in the bow, but nobody in that room was thinking about technique anymore. They were thinking about the last time they had lost something they loved, or feared losing something they had not yet learned to appreciate. Camille's smile faded first, It happened slowly, the way ice melts, not all at once but in a steady retreat, until her face held nothing but stillness. The girl beside her, who had been giggling moments earlier, now sat with her lips slightly parted, her eyes fixed on Elena's hands. The melody rose, just slightly, a small swell of something like hope, before settling back down into the same quiet ache it had started with. Elena drew the final note out long, letting it fade into the silence of the room rather than cutting it off. When she lowered the bow, the classroom did not erupt into applause right away. It sat in silence for 3 full seconds, which in a room full of teenagers is an eternity. Then someone in the front row began to clap, and it spread, uneven at first, then steady. Mr. Douglas stood with his hand over his chest, blinking fast. "That," he said, his voice slightly rough, "is exactly what I meant by feeling." Elena lowered the violin and looked at the floor. Her face was warm, not from embarrassment this time, but from something she did not have a name for yet. She had not expected the room to go quiet like that. She had expected laughter, or worse, indifference. She had not expected anyone to actually listen. She glanced up, just once, toward the front row. Camille was staring at her, and for the first time since Elena had arrived at Ashworth Academy, there was no mockery in the other girl's expression. There was something else instead, something Elena could not quite read. It might have been surprise. It might have been something closer to discomfort, the kind of feeling that comes when the story you have been telling yourself about another person suddenly does not fit anymore. The bell rang, cutting through the moment like a knife through thread. Students gathered their bags and filed out, several of them glancing at Elena as they passed, a few even offering small nods or quiet words of praise. Elena packed her violin with steady hands now, the earlier tremor gone, replaced by something calmer. As she reached the door, a voice stopped her. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elena turned. It was Grace Lynn, a girl from her literature class who Elena had exchanged maybe 10 words with before today. Grace was looking at her with open curiosity, none of the careful distance most students kept. "My mother taught me," Elena said, "when I was little." "It was beautiful," Grace said simply. "I mean it. That was the first time I've heard anyone in this school play something that actually meant something." Elena did not know what to say to that, so she offered a small smile and a thank you, and the two of them walked out into the hallway together, which was, in its own small way, the first true kindness Elena had received since arriving at Ashworth Academy. Behind them, Camille lingered in the classroom a moment longer than the others, staring at the empty space where Elena had stood, at the chalk-dusted chair beside the piano, as if trying to understand something that refused to be understood. She did not know it yet, but the story she had built about herself, about being the center of every room she entered, had just cracked in a place she could not easily repair. She picked up her bag, straightened her shoulders, and walked out into the hallway with her usual confident stride, already deciding that this was nothing, that it meant nothing, that by tomorrow no one would even remember it. She was wrong about that, though she would not understand how wrong until much later. Outside, the afternoon sun poured through tall windows, lighting up the hallway in gold. Elena walked toward her next class with her violin case held a little less tightly than before, a small, unfamiliar feeling rising in her chest. For the first time in 3 weeks, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, and though she was not yet sure whether that was a good thing or a dangerous one, she let herself hold on to it a little longer than she probably should have. She had no way of knowing that a phone had been recording the entire performance from 3 rows back, held low beneath a desk, capturing every note, every silence, every expression on Camille's face as her practiced composure slipped. She had no way of knowing that within hours, that recording would leave the classroom, leave the school, and begin traveling further than she could imagine. For now, she only knew the weight of her mother's violin against her hip, familiar and steady, and the small, fragile hope that maybe, in this cold and unfamiliar place, she had finally found one crack of light. She did not look back toward the classroom again. If she had, she would have seen Camille standing alone by the window, phone in hand, watching a video that a classmate had already sent her, her jaw tight, her eyes narrowed, not in anger exactly, but in the particular discomfort of a girl who has always known exactly who she is, suddenly uncertain for the first time in her life. The bell rang again in the distance, calling the next class to order, and the hallway slowly emptied, leaving behind only the faint echo of a melody that had already begun to change more than one life inside those marble walls. By the time Elena reached the school parking lot that afternoon, her phone would not stop buzzing. She almost did not check it, thinking it was another reminder from the scholarship office about paperwork, but when she finally looked, she found 17 messages from numbers she did not recognize, and a link that had already been shared across half the grade. She pressed play with her thumb trembling slightly, standing beside the bus stop where she waited every day, because her small apartment across town had no room in the budget for a car, let alone a driver like most of her classmates had. The video loaded, and there she was, small and clear on the screen, lifting her mother's violin in front of a room that had expected her to fail. The caption above the video read, in bold letters, "The new scholarship girl just silenced the whole class." Someone had added music note symbols. Someone else had written underneath, "This gave me chills, no exaggeration." Elena watched the video twice, her own face on the screen looking so much more composed than she had felt in that moment. And then she closed the app and slid the phone into her pocket, unsure whether to feel proud or afraid. She did not have long to decide. By the next morning, the video had traveled well beyond Ashworth Academy. It had been picked up by a local account that reposted talented students from private schools around the city, and from there it had found its way onto larger pages, ones with hundreds of thousands of followers, ones that had nothing to do with the school at all. Comments piled up by the hundreds, then the thousands. People from countries Elena had never visited were writing things like, "This is what real talent looks like," and, "Someone give this girl a stage, not a school hallway." Grace found her at her locker before first period, phone already in hand. "Have you seen the numbers?" she asked, breathless. "It's not just here. It's everywhere." Elena shook her head slowly, still trying to process the strange sensation of being both thrilled and deeply unsettled. She had wanted, for most of her life, for someone to hear her play the way her mother used to hear her, with full attention, with real understanding. She had never wanted this many eyes on her at once. It felt like standing in an open field during a storm, exposed on every side, with no way to predict which direction the next gust would come from. "I don't know how to feel about it," Elena admitted. "Feel proud," Grace said firmly. "You earned every second of it." They walked toward homeroom together, and for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Academy, Elena noticed people looking at her differently in the hallway, not the sneering glances she had grown used to, but something closer to curiosity, even admiration. A boy she did not know, tall with a friendly open face, nodded at her as she passed and said, "That was incredible, by the way," before continuing on to his own class. Elena managed a small smile in return, still unused to the feeling of being noticed for something good. Not everyone shared the sudden warmth. Camille arrived at school that morning, already aware of exactly how far the video had spread, because her own name had begun appearing in the comments beneath it. People had recognized her from the video, and not in the way she was used to being recognized. Instead of admiration, the comments aimed at her were sharp. Someone wrote, "The unkind rich girl in the front row got exactly what she deserved." Another wrote, "Imagine having everything and still resenting someone with so little." The words stung more than Camille wanted to admit, though she would never have shown it, not even to her closest friends. She arrived at her locker with her chin held high, her posture perfect, giving away nothing. Her two closest friends, Priya and Noah, were already waiting for her, phones in hand, both of them wisely choosing not to bring up the video directly. "Did you see it blew up overnight?" Noah asked instead, careful with his tone. "Like, actually blew up? There's an account with 1 million followers that reposted it." "I saw," Camille said flatly, opening her locker and pulling out her books with more force than necessary. "People are saying some things about you in the comments," Priya added carefully. "I mean, it's probably nothing. People online say all kinds of things about everyone." Camille shut her locker firmly. "I don't care what strangers on the internet think of me," she said, though the tightness in her jaw suggested otherwise. "It's one video. It'll be forgotten in a week." But it was not forgotten in a week, or even in a day. By lunchtime, teachers were talking about it in the staff lounge. By the end of the school day, a local news outlet had reached out to the school requesting an interview with Elena. The headmaster, a tall, serious man named Mr. Whitfield, called Elena into his office during her free period, and for a moment, Elena feared she was in trouble, though she could not think of anything she had done wrong. Instead, Mr. Whitfield greeted her with an unusually wide smile. "Miss Marsh," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "you have done something remarkable for this school's reputation. Do you understand how many parents have already called the admissions office this morning asking about our music program?" Elena sat carefully in the chair across from his desk, unsure how to respond. "I didn't mean for it to become such a big thing," she said honestly. "I just played." "Sometimes the simplest things carry the most weight," Mr. Whitfield replied. "I want you to know the school fully supports you. If you're comfortable, we would like to feature you in some of our promotional materials, and there is interest from a few local news programs. Nothing you're required to do, of course, but opportunities like this rarely come without reason." Elena nodded slowly, though a small knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She had come to this school hoping to disappear quietly into her studies, to work hard and stay unnoticed until she could earn a real future for herself. Something stable, something her mother would have been proud of. She had never expected to become the center of attention, especially not this fast. Walking out of the headmaster's office, she nearly collided with Camille, who was leaning against the wall just outside the door, clearly waiting. "Congratulations," Camille said, her voice carrying an edge that did not quite match the word. "Seems like you got exactly what you wanted." "I didn't want any of this," Elena said quietly, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I just wanted to play my violin without being laughed at." Something flickered across Camille's face, there and gone before Elena could name it. "Well, you're definitely not being laughed at anymore," Camille said, and there was something almost bitter beneath the words, something that sounded less like mockery and more like an old wound being pressed. She turned and walked away before Elena could respond, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each step a little too fast to be entirely casual. Elena watched her go, confused by the shift she had just witnessed. The girl who had laughed at her in the hallway 3 weeks ago, who had set her up to fail in front of the entire music class, now looked less like someone celebrating a rival's embarrassment and more like someone watching her own carefully built world begin to wobble. That evening, Elena sat on the small balcony of her apartment, violin case resting against her knees, phone buzzing steadily with notifications she had stopped reading individually. Her aunt, who she lived with since her mother's passing, brought out 2 cups of tea and sat beside her without saying much, simply offering quiet company the way she often did. "Your mother would be so proud," her aunt said eventually, looking out over the darkening street. "She always said your playing had something in it other people's didn't, something honest." Elena smiled, though her eyes stung slightly. "I keep thinking about what she would say if she saw all this," she admitted. "The video, the messages, all of it. I don't know if she'd love it or worry about it." "Probably both," her aunt said with a small laugh. "That sounds about right for her." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sky deepened into evening, the city lights flickering on one by one in the distance. Elena's phone buzzed again, and this time she glanced at it, expecting another stranger's comment. Instead, it was a message from an unfamiliar number, formatted with the kind of polished formality that suggested it came from someone important. The message read, "On behalf of Mr. Richard Ashworth, we would be honored to invite Elena Marsh to perform at the annual Ashworth Foundation Charity Gala next month. Please contact this number to discuss details." Elena read the message 3 times before she fully understood what it meant. Richard Ashworth, Camille's father, the man whose company name appeared on half the technology in the country, whose foundation raised millions of dollars each year for causes she had only ever read about in news articles. She lowered the phone slowly, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time, and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying realization that her small, private melody, written in grief on the edge of a hospital bed, had somehow reached all the way to the top of a world she had never imagined being part of. Across town, in a house far larger than Elena's entire apartment building, Camille sat at her own family's grand piano, fingers resting on the keys without pressing down. She had overheard her father on the phone earlier that evening, his voice warm with the kind of enthusiasm he rarely showed for anything outside of business, discussing a certain scholarship student and an upcoming gala performance. For reasons she could not fully explain, even to herself, the news left her feeling strange and hollow, as if something she had always assumed belonged to her, some invisible claim on being the most talented, the most admired, the most watched, had quietly slipped out of her hands without her permission. She pressed one key, softly, and let the note fade into the silence of the empty room, wondering, for the first time in a long while, what it might feel like to make someone stop and truly listen the way Elena had. The weeks leading up to the gala moved faster than Elena could fully absorb. She met with a representative from the Ashworth Foundation, a calm, efficient woman named Olivia Turner, who walked her through the details of the evening with the patience of someone who had clearly done this many times before, though never quite like this. There would be nearly 300 guests, Olivia explained, business leaders, philanthropists, a handful of minor celebrities who supported the foundation's causes, and, most importantly, potential donors whose contributions funded scholarships just like Elena's own. "Mr. Ashworth was very specific," Olivia said, reviewing her notes as they sat in a quiet corner of the school library. "He wants you to perform an original piece, something personal," he said, and I'm quoting him directly, "that the world has enough performers playing music written by people who died centuries ago. He wants to hear something alive." Elena absorbed this with a mixture of excitement and dread. She had one piece that felt right for an evening like this. The same piece she had played in Mr. Douglas's classroom, the one written in memory of her mother. But playing it for 30 classmates was one thing. Playing it for 300 strangers with more money and influence than she could imagine felt like an entirely different kind of exposure. What if it's not good enough? She asked quietly, more to herself than to Olivia. Olivia looked up from her notes, her expression softening. Elena, do you know how many polished, technically perfect performers come through events like this every year? Dozens. What made your video spread the way it did wasn't perfection. It was honesty. That's rare. And it's exactly what people are hungry for, whether they know it or not. The words settled somewhere deep in Elena's chest, and for the first time since the invitation arrived, the knot of anxiety in her stomach loosened just slightly. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Academy, the atmosphere around Camille had shifted in ways that were difficult to ignore. The video's spread had cooled slightly in the wider world, replaced by newer trends and newer stories, the way these things always were. But within the walls of the school, the memory lingered. Students who had once treated Camille's opinion as something close to law now hesitated slightly before laughing at her jokes, watched her reactions a beat too carefully, as if waiting to see whether kindness or cruelty would win out in each new interaction. It bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Camille had spent her entire life being the center of every room, not because she demanded it, though sometimes she did, but because it had simply always been true. Her father's success had built the world around her long before she understood what success even meant. Teachers praised her without always meaning it. Friends agreed with her without always believing it. She had grown so used to being the loudest voice in any conversation that she had never learned what it felt like to be quietly, genuinely moved by someone else's talent, until the day Elena lifted that worn violin in a classroom that smelled like chalk dust and old carpet. She found herself, more often than she liked, thinking about that melody. It played in her mind during class, during dinner, during the long stretches of practicing piano that her tutor insisted upon, 3 hours every evening, technically flawless and utterly forgettable. She had been playing piano since she was 4 years old. She had performed at small recitals, at family gatherings, even once at a charity event much smaller than the one now being planned around Elena. She had always assumed she was talented. Watching Elena's video again and again, she began to understand, with a discomfort she could not shake, the difference between playing notes correctly and actually saying something true through them. One evening, unable to sleep, Camille wandered down to the music room in her family's enormous house, the one with the grand piano her father had purchased the year she turned 10, an instrument worth more than most people's homes. She sat down at the bench and pressed her fingers to the keys, playing through a piece she had memorized years ago, technically perfect, each note landing exactly where it should. When she finished, the silence in the room felt heavier than before she had started, and she understood, with a clarity that stung, that nothing she had just played would have made a single person in that classroom stop laughing and start crying. She closed the piano lid gently and sat in the dark for a long while, arms wrapped around herself, feeling smaller than she had in years. The morning of the gala, Elena woke before her alarm, her stomach tight with nerves she had been carrying for days. Her aunt had taken the day off work, an unusual sacrifice given their tight finances, to help Elena prepare. Together they had found a modest black dress at a second-hand shop, simple and elegant, nothing like the designer gowns Elena imagined the other guests would wear. But it fit her well, and when she looked in the mirror, she felt, for the first time in weeks, like herself. "You look beautiful," her aunt said, adjusting a small clip in Elena's hair. "But more than that, you look ready." Elena studied her reflection, the violin case resting against the wall behind her, and tried to believe it. The Ashworth estate, when she arrived that evening, was unlike anything she had ever seen in person. The driveway alone stretched longer than her entire street back home, lined with tall trees strung with soft white lights. The mansion itself rose 3 stories, its windows glowing warm and gold, and the sound of a string quartet drifted faintly from somewhere inside, warming up before the main event. Olivia met her at the entrance, offering a reassuring smile. "You're going to do wonderfully," she said, guiding Elena through a side entrance toward a small room set aside for performers. "You'll be the final performance of the evening, right before Mr. Ashworth gives his closing remarks. It's a place of honor. He specifically requested it." Elena nodded, though her nerves spiked at the thought of being the evening's grand finale, rather than a small addition slipped in somewhere in the middle. As she waited backstage, running her fingers along the familiar grain of her mother's violin, the door opened, and Camille stepped inside. For a moment, neither girl spoke. Camille wore a deep emerald gown that fit her perfectly, her hair swept up in an elegant style, Every inch the picture of a billionaire's daughter at her family's most important event of the year, but her expression carried none of the confidence her appearance suggested. "I wanted to talk to you before you go on," Camille said, her voice quieter than Elena had ever heard it. Elena straightened slightly, unsure what to expect. Their last real conversation, days earlier in the school hallway, had ended with Camille walking away in obvious frustration. "Okay," Elena said carefully. Camille took a breath, glancing toward the closed door as if making sure no one else could hear. "I've been horrible to you," she said, the words coming out stiff, clearly unpracticed, clearly difficult for her to say. "Since the day you got here. I made assumptions about you because of the scholarship, because you didn't come from money, and I used that to make myself feel bigger. I'm not proud of it." Elena stayed silent, letting Camille continue, sensing this was not something the other girl said often, if ever. "When you played in Mr. Douglas's class," Camille went on, "I laughed because I expected you to fail, and when you didn't, when you did something I've never been able to do with all my lessons and all my talent, it made me feel small, and instead of admitting that, I got angry at you instead of angry at myself." She paused, twisting a ring on her finger, a nervous habit Elena had never seen her display before. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I just needed to say it before you go out there, because you deserve better than what I gave you these past few weeks." Elena studied her for a long moment, searching for insincerity, for the practiced performance Camille was so skilled at, but found none. What she saw instead was a girl who looked for the first time since Elena had met her, genuinely uncertain of herself. "Thank you for saying that," Elena said finally. "It means something." Camille nodded, and something in her shoulders loosened slightly, as if she had been carrying the weight of unspoken words for longer than she realized. "Your performance tonight," she said, changing the subject slightly, though her voice remained soft. "It's not just for the donors. My father built this foundation because he believes talent shouldn't depend on how much money someone's family has. You're proof of that. Whatever happens out there, that's already true." Before Elena could respond, Olivia knocked gently on the door, signaling that the previous performer, a young cellist from the city's youth orchestra, had just finished, and the evening was moving toward its final segment. "Good luck," Camille said, stepping back toward the door. She hesitated there for a moment, hand on the frame, before adding, quieter than before, "I mean that, truly." Then she was gone, disappearing back into the crowd of guests, leaving Elena alone with her violin, and the sudden, unexpected warmth of an apology she had never expected to receive. Elena closed her eyes, breathing slowly, letting the weight of Camille's words settle alongside her nerves. She thought of her mother, of quiet evenings spent practicing scales in their small living room, of the way her mother used to say that music was not about being heard by everyone, but about being honest with the people who chose to listen. Tonight, 300 strangers waited beyond that door, ready to listen. When Olivia finally opened the door and gestured for her to step forward, Elena lifted her mother's violin, tucked it beneath her chin, and walked out into the light. The ballroom stretched before her, larger than any space she had ever performed in. Its high ceiling hung with 3 enormous chandeliers that scattered soft light across round tables covered in white linen. 300 faces turned toward the small stage at the front of the room, some curious, some politely attentive, a few clearly checking their phones beneath the table, unaware of what was about to happen. At the center table nearest the stage sat Richard Ashworth, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and sharp, observant eyes, the kind of presence that filled a room without him needing to say a word. Beside him sat Camille, who caught Elena's gaze from across the room and offered the smallest, steadiest nod, an unspoken message of encouragement that settled something nervous in Elena's chest. A microphone stood near the edge of the stage, and Elena stepped toward it, her violin resting against her shoulder, her bow steady in her hand despite the trembling she felt in her knees. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, steadier than she expected. "My name is Elena Marsh. I don't have a long speech prepared. I just have a piece of music that means a great deal to me, and I'd like to share it with you tonight." She paused, glancing briefly toward the back of the room where her aunt stood near the entrance, having been allowed in as a guest for the evening, tears already gathering in her eyes before a single note had been played. "This piece is called Still Here," Elena continued. "I wrote it for my mother." The room fell quiet in a way that felt different from the silence in Mr. Douglas's classroom weeks earlier. This silence was heavier, more attentive, 300 strangers leaning forward slightly in their seats without fully realizing they were doing it. Elena lifted her bow and began to play. The melody unfolded the same way it always did, quiet and searching at first, each note like a small step taken carefully across unfamiliar ground. But something in the room's stillness, in the weight of all those watching eyes, drew something new out of her performance, a depth she had not fully reached even in the classroom. The notes swelled gradually, carrying with them the particular ache of every hospital visit, every quiet night spent listening to machines beep steadily in place of a heartbeat that had once been strong, every moment of grief that had slowly, carefully, been transformed into something bearable through music. Near the middle of the piece, the melody shifted into something brighter, a passage Elena had written to represent the good memories, the mornings her mother had woken her with music playing softly from the kitchen, the way she used to dance barefoot across their small living room floor, laughing at nothing in particular. The bow moved faster here, lighter, and for a moment, the sorrow in the room lifted, replaced by something closer to warmth. Then the melody slowed again, returning to its original ache, but this time, it did not feel like loss alone. It felt like acceptance, like carrying grief forward not as a weight, but as a kind of quiet company, a reminder of love that had not disappeared, only changed shape. Elena drew the final note out long, the way she always did, letting it hang in the air until it faded into nothing, and when she finally lowered her bow, the ballroom remained silent for a long moment, much longer than the 3 seconds in Mr. Douglas's classroom. Then Richard Ashworth stood, slowly, and began to clap, and the entire room rose with him, applause thundering through the space, several guests wiping at their eyes, others simply staring at the small, unassuming girl on stage with an expression of genuine awe. Elena bowed slightly, overwhelmed, her own eyes stinging, and searched the crowd until she found her aunt, who was openly crying now, one hand pressed to her heart. Richard Ashworth approached the stage as the applause slowly settled, taking the microphone from its stand with the easy confidence of a man used to addressing rooms far larger than this one. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice warm, but carrying clearly across the ballroom, "this is precisely why the Ashworth Foundation exists. Talent like this does not care about the size of someone's bank account. It exists everywhere, waiting to be given a stage. Tonight, Elena Marsh reminded all of us why we do this work." He turned toward Elena, extending a hand, which she shook, still slightly dazed by the enormity of the moment. "Young lady," he said quietly, just for her to hear, "I have sat through more performances than I can count in this room, most of them technically impressive, few of them memorable. I will remember this one for a long time." Elena managed a shaky thank you, before Olivia gently guided her off stage, back into the quiet of the small performer's room, where the sound of the ongoing applause and conversation still drifted faintly through the walls. She sat down heavily in a chair, violin resting across her lap, and allowed herself, finally, to cry, not from sadness but from the sheer release of emotion she had been holding tightly for weeks. Her aunt found her there minutes later, wrapping her in a tight embrace, both of them laughing through their tears at the strange, overwhelming beauty of the evening. News of the performance spread even faster than the original classroom video had. By the following morning, local news programs were running segments about the scholarship student who had moved an entire ballroom of the city's wealthiest donors to tears. Applications for the school's music scholarship program tripled within a week. Messages from music schools, from small orchestras, even from a modest recording studio interested in producing an album of her original compositions, began arriving faster than Elena could respond to them. Back at Ashworth Academy, the shift in atmosphere around Elena became undeniable. Students who had once ignored her now greeted her by name in the hallways. Teachers spoke of her with open pride. Even Mr. Whitfield, usually reserved in his praise, mentioned her achievement during the school's morning announcements, prompting a ripple of applause from students gathered in the auditorium. Camille watched all of this unfold with an expression that had grown steadily more thoughtful over the following days, no longer guarded or defensive, but genuinely reflective. She had expected, on some level, to feel the same sting of jealousy she had felt weeks earlier, watching someone else receive the kind of admiration she had always assumed was reserved for people like her. Instead, she found herself feeling something closer to quiet respect, and beneath that, a stirring curiosity about what it might mean to create something as honest as what she had witnessed on that stage. She began spending her free periods in the music wing more often, not performing, simply listening, sometimes to the school's orchestra rehearsing, sometimes to Elena practicing alone in one of the smaller rooms, the door left slightly open. She never announced her presence, content simply to stand in the hallway and listen, absorbing something she had never allowed herself to notice before, the difference between music played correctly and music played truthfully. One afternoon, as Elena packed up her violin after a long rehearsal, She noticed Camille standing quietly near the doorway, watching. "You don't have to hide out there," Elena said, not unkindly, offering a small smile. Camille stepped inside, looking almost shy, an expression that seemed entirely unfamiliar on her usually composed face. "I wasn't hiding," she said. "I was listening. There's a difference." "Fair enough," Elena said, latching her violin case shut. Camille lingered near the piano in the corner of the room, running her fingers lightly along its closed lid. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a moment. "Sure. How do you do it?" "Make something sound so real. I've been playing piano for 14 years, and I don't think I've ever made a single person feel what you made that entire ballroom feel." Elena considered the question carefully, sensing it carried more weight than its casual delivery suggested. "I think it's because I stopped trying to impress anyone," she said finally. "I just tried to tell the truth. My mother used to say that the notes don't matter as much as what you're feeling when you play them. If you're not feeling anything, the audience won't either, no matter how perfectly you play." Camille absorbed this in silence, her fingers still resting lightly on the piano lid, as though considering, for the first time in a long while, what she might actually feel if she let herself. "Would you ever want to play something together?" she asked suddenly, the words tumbling out faster than she seemed to intend, as though she had surprised even herself by asking. Elena studied her for a moment, searching for any trace of the old mockery, the old performance of superiority, and found none, only genuine, slightly nervous hope. "I'd like that," Elena said, and meant it. Over the following weeks, something quietly remarkable began to take shape inside the small practice rooms of Ashworth Academy. Camille started arriving after her regular lessons, no longer content with the rigid, technically flawless pieces her tutor assigned her. She brought sheet music of her own occasionally, simple compositions she had never shown anyone, small fragments of melody she had written years ago and tucked away, embarrassed by how unfinished and imperfect they seemed compared to the concert pieces she had spent her whole life mastering. Elena listened to these fragments with genuine interest rather than judgment, and slowly, carefully, the two girls began building something together. Elena would play a phrase on her violin, and Camille would search for a harmony beneath it on the piano, hesitant at first, second-guessing every note, glancing up anxiously to see if she had gotten it wrong. Elena never criticized these attempts. Instead, she would nod, encourage her to keep going, and gradually, Camille's hesitation began to fade, replaced by something bolder, something that sounded, for the first time in her life, entirely her own. Their friendship did not form overnight, and it was not without awkward moments. There were afternoons when old habits resurfaced, when Camille would slip into her usual sharp humor without thinking, forgetting for a moment how much that same humor had once wounded the girl beside her. There were times Elena still flinched slightly at certain tones in Camille's voice, old wariness not easily erased by a single apology. But both girls kept showing up, kept choosing to sit at the same bench, kept choosing patience over old grudges, and slowly, the space between them narrowed into something that resembled, unmistakably, genuine friendship. Grace noticed the change first, catching the two of them laughing together over a mistake Camille had made in a difficult passage, an easy, unguarded laugh that neither girl seemed to be performing for anyone else's benefit. "Never thought I'd see this," Grace said one afternoon, leaning against the practice room doorway with a knowing smile. "Neither did I," Camille admitted, not looking up from the piano keys, "but I'm glad I was wrong about her." News of the school's upcoming spring showcase arrived a few weeks later, an annual tradition, where students performed original or classical pieces in front of the entire school, and a panel of visiting judges from local music programs. In previous years, Camille had always performed a technically demanding classical piece, chosen specifically to demonstrate her skill and impress the judges. This year, she approached Mr. Douglas after class, with a request that clearly surprised him. "I want to perform something original," she said, "with Elena, if she's willing." Mr. Douglas raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "That's quite a departure from your usual repertoire, Miss Ashworth." "I know," Camille said. "That's kind of the point." When she brought the idea to Elena later that day, she seemed uncharacteristically nervous, twisting the strap of her bag between her fingers. "We don't have to," she added quickly. "I know it's a big stage, and if you'd rather perform alone, I completely understand." "I want to," Elena said simply, and the relief on Camille's face was immediate and unguarded. They spent the following weeks refining a piece they had been slowly building together in their practice sessions, something neither of them had originally planned but which had emerged naturally from months of quiet collaboration. It began with Elena's violin carrying a melody rooted in memory and grief, the same emotional honesty that had first moved an entire classroom to silence. But this time, Camille's piano joined partway through, not as accompaniment exactly, but as a second voice entirely, one that spoke of a different kind of struggle, the quiet loneliness of a girl who had spent her whole life surrounded by people, yet rarely felt truly seen. The two melodies wove together unevenly at first during rehearsals, occasionally clashing, occasionally finding unexpected harmony, much like the friendship that had produced them. But gradually, through patient practice, the piece found its shape, imperfect in places but undeniably alive, carrying within it the full arc of two very different girls learning, slowly and honestly, to understand each other. The night of the spring showcase arrived with the entire school auditorium filled to capacity. Families and faculty gathered in rows of red velvet seats, the panel of visiting judges seated near the front with notepads resting on their laps. Elena stood backstage beside Camille, both of them dressed simply this time. No elaborate gowns, no attempt to impress anyone beyond the music itself. "Nervous?" Elena asked quietly as they waited for their turn. "Terrified," Camille admitted with a small laugh. "I've performed in front of judges my whole life, but never like this. Never something that's actually mine." "That's exactly why it'll be good," Elena said. "Remember what I told you. Feel it first, the rest follows." When their names were called, they walked out together, Elena carrying her mother's violin, Camille settling at the piano bench positioned beside the small stage. The auditorium quieted, and for a brief moment, Elena caught sight of Richard Ashworth in the audience, seated beside her own aunt, an unlikely pairing that had formed naturally over the past months as their daughter's friendship deepened. Elena lifted her violin, and Camille rested her fingers lightly on the piano keys, and together, without a word exchanged, they began. The melody unfolded slowly at first, Elena's violin carrying the familiar ache that had first captured attention months earlier, but this time, after only a few measures, Camille's piano entered beneath it, soft and searching, a second story layered carefully beneath the first. The two melodies moved independently for a while, each carrying its own weight, its own history, before gradually, inevitably, they began to intertwine. The audience listened in complete stillness, drawn into the unfolding conversation between violin and piano, between grief and loneliness, between two girls who had started as strangers, then rivals, and slowly, carefully, become something far more meaningful. The piece rose toward its climax, both instruments now moving together in full harmony, the earlier tension of separate melodies resolving into something whole and unified, a sound neither girl could have created alone. As the final notes faded into silence, the auditorium held its breath for a long moment, the same heavy, attentive silence Elena had learned to recognize as the truest form of applause, before the entire room rose to its feet, the sound of clapping filling the space like a wave breaking over the stage. Elena and Camille stood together, hands finding each other briefly in the overwhelming noise, both of them smiling, both slightly breathless, neither quite able to believe what they had just accomplished together. Backstage afterward, Richard Ashworth found them both, his expression carrying none of the polished formality Elena remembered from the gala months earlier, only genuine warmth. "I have watched my daughter perform countless times," he said, placing a hand briefly on Camille's shoulder, "but I have never seen her play like that. Truly play, I mean, not simply perform." Camille's eyes glistened slightly, and she did not try to hide it, another small but meaningful change from the girl who had once guarded every emotion behind careful composure. The judges awarded the piece top honors that evening, though by that point, the recognition felt almost secondary to what the two girls had actually built together over the preceding months. As the school year drew toward its close, their friendship continued to deepen, no longer defined by the old roles of scholarship student and billionaire's daughter, but by something far simpler and far more durable. Two people who had learned to truly listen to each other. On the final day of the school year, as students cleared out lockers and said their goodbyes for the summer, Elena and Camille sat together on the front steps of Ashworth Academy, violin case and a small folder of sheet music resting between them. "Do you remember the first day we met?" Camille asked, watching the last of the students filter out toward waiting cars and buses. "I remember," Elena said with a small, wry smile. "You knocked my violin case out of my hands." "I was terrible," Camille admitted, shaking her head. "I don't think I fully understood how terrible, until I watched you play that day in class. It's strange. That moment I meant to embarrass you ended up being the thing that changed everything, for both of us." Elena considered this, watching the late afternoon sun stretch long shadows across the school's front lawn. "I think that's how a lot of important things happen," she said. "Not the way we expect." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, two girls from entirely different worlds who had somehow found their way toward genuine friendship, built not on shared circumstances but on shared honesty, on a willingness to listen past first impressions, past old wounds, toward something truer underneath. In the years that followed, their story would occasionally resurface in interviews and profile pieces, particularly as Elena's musical career began to grow beyond the walls of Ashworth Academy, her original compositions eventually finding their way into concert halls far larger than the school auditorium where it had all begun. Reporters would ask, inevitably, about the now famous video that had started it all, the moment a billionaire's daughter laughed at a quiet scholarship student, who then silenced an entire room with a single, unforgettable melody. Elena always answered the question the same way, with the same quiet honesty that had defined her from the very beginning. "That video wasn't really about me proving anyone wrong," she would say. "It was about learning that the truest things we carry inside us, the grief, the love, the parts of ourselves we're afraid to show, are usually exactly what other people need to hear most. I got lucky. I found someone willing to listen past what she expected to see. Not everyone gets that chance, and I've never forgotten how rare it is." And somewhere in the audience of whatever venue she happened to be speaking at, more often than not, Camille would be sitting quietly among the crowd, no longer needing to be the center of every room, content instead to watch her closest friend do what she had always been meant to do, share something real with people willing enough and brave enough to truly listen.